Come on. That looks about right. Okay. Give it a second for anyone else logging in. Then we'll get down to our discussion. As promised from our last session, we are going to be looking at the Seder. We'll be looking at Pesach. I've done many classes in person and online regarding Pesach for the halacha, for questions of what is kosher, what is not kosher, preparation. But I haven't done as much as well, I want to about the actual Seder itself. And we're going to start off with the Seder plate, which is a ubiquitous feature in so many homes. It is one of the first pieces of Judaica that many families will have. You can usually find candlesticks, something for Hanukkah, Hanukkah, and you'll probably find a Seder plate. Even if there is nothing else Jewish in the house, this is likely to be one of the main things that you will find that indicate this is a Jewish home. And the Seder continues to be one of, if not the most widely practiced Jewish holiday, even by Jews that are not observant of other aspects of Judaism or do not participate in organized Jewish life. So it's clearly important, but it's also clearly misunderstood. The Seder plate is a wonderful invention, but it is one of those aspects of Judaism where we can see through its evolution a growing body of interpretation and a growing body of misunderstanding. So we're going to take this through piece by piece. We're going to mostly focus on the Seder plate today. We'll see how far we get and talk about what it began as, and then talk about how it evolved and about what we can do with it today. So let's go ahead and go back into our Wayback Machine and understand that the original Seder plate, there was no Seder plate. I hate to burst anybody's bubble. First of all, if we're back in Egypt, no plate is described in the Torah. No discussion of having a set piece of crockery or other, excuse me, or other utensil as being a part of the Passover offering. It was all about the ingredients, not about the way that they were presented. The first beginning or inkling of a Seder plate comes in the Mishnah. Now, the Mishnah was being written during the time of Roman occupation. It is based upon the oral tradition of the sages and rabbis of those times. So we're looking a little bit before the Common Era and after the Common Era. Right around year zero, they were describing what their Seder looked like. And although the Torah talks about having the Passover offering every year, we see this described in other parts of the Tanakh, we don't actually get a description of a Seder that we would recognize until we get to the Mishnaic time. But even there, it is a little bit more skeleton. It is not fully described and laid out in 100% of the detail that we have come to know. So let's understand what they began with. So what they began with was, in fact, a movable table or tray. Oftentimes it's described as being sort of wickerwork or some other form of just a tray that would be moved in and out. And this was a functional piece, not a symbolic piece. If we look at the picture here at the bottom, this will give you an idea of what a Seder might have looked like. Now, this is technically a Roman picture. That's why they're not wearing kippot, don't have beards, etc. But the Seder that we know and love was patterned around the banqueting furniture of the classical Roman period. As much as we hated Roman occupation, we followed many of their customs and traditions when it came to how we dressed and how we would lay out our homes and how we would lay out our feasts. And Roman eating was done usually on these low couches. You'll notice that people are around the tables and that the tables would be sort of laid in front of them. Even more graphically, you can see in this picture that there would have been a table that would be brought in and out or trays brought in and out to put on the table that would contain the things that people would be picking from as they were enjoying their meal. And a sofa of a very fancy person might have looked something like this. You'll notice that one of the main distinguishing features here is that there really isn't a shared major table. There is a small table, and indeed, and many times it would have been multiple tables spread around, and everybody would have had on their own table what they needed. A communal Seder plate wasn't really feasible because everyone needed to reach it, and nobody was sitting at the same big communal table the way we now do in most of our Western countries. And that is our first clue as how the Seder plate evolved. In this classical period, they talk about the elements being brought out and placed in proper positioning in order to be used for the different steps of the Seder. And as such, it's clear that these were being added as the evening went on. They were not all there neatly arranged in advance, because how could you neatly arrange them so that everyone could reach? Everybody has to have them served by the attendants throughout the evening in order that they are put within reach of everybody. This arrangement also answers a number of other questions about the Seder that many people have asked me. One of them is, how do we recline? What do we mean by reclining at the Seder? In our modern era where we have upright chairs, it doesn't make a whole lot of sense. Many of us have made an accommodation. We'll put an extra pillow. We will lean when we are performing different acts, such as the drinking of the Kiddush cups, as a way of nodding to the recumbent posture that is mentioned in the four questions and that is mentioned in the Mishnah's literature. But if you look at this picture, or you look at these sofas here, you'll understand what they meant by reclining. The reclining was actually reclining. It was like having a lounge chair. If you wanted to duplicate this with your modern patio furniture, you'd be much more able to do so than with your dining room furniture. Put out your patio chairs, your sunbathing recliners, gather a little table next to each, and you are much closer to what the authors of the Mishnah experienced when they had a Seder than you are when you are solemnly gathered around a more medieval European style communal table, huddled together in one room with one giant slab of wood. Now, this has very good historical reasons. In the ancient world, we were still evolving our furniture settings. That is to say, we were still building up a material culture. I know it's not often thought about. It's one of the weird things that my brain drifts to, but humans didn't begin with furniture. We began as primates, we began as hominids, and we did the best we could, but most of the time we ate just sort of sitting on the floor. And this couch arrangement is the next step up, where I'm sitting like I would have been sitting on the floor, but I'm doing so on something a little bit more comfortable. You can see the netting here that would have provided a kind of mattress experience, and obviously here they would have had more pillows and other support, but it's basically just a glorified version of sitting on the ground. And that makes perfect sense. Certainly our ancestors in Egypt would have sat on the ground. They were not able to have dining rooms with dedicated dining tables, large wooden constructed objects that had no purpose other than supporting food when I happened to be eating, and otherwise made the room less usable for other times, let alone to create the chairs that were needed for that time that would have no purpose other than when sitting at that table. Not like they were sitting doing computer work or anything, and most of them weren't sitting around writing. So having this style of furniture and of living and of eating makes perfect sense in that time. Later on, we developed a material culture that could create dedicated tables, dedicated spaces, and eventually that became the predominant form. Our whole modern form of living now, where we have multiple rooms in our homes doing multiple jobs, and having furniture that dominates them 24/7, even when not being used. I'm sure that many of you have dining rooms that don't get used except for very special occasions. And many of you might have grown up with families that had living rooms covered in plastic, and then there was a den where you actually used that kind of luxury, of extravagance, of having enough wealth to create objects that were not routinely used is a relatively modern phenomenon. And as such, our ancestors were able to serve themselves with their servants and with their individual dishes in this manner for Passover for most of our classical period. This is what it would have looked like during the days of the Mishnah. This is a very closer approximation to what it would have looked like in the early days of the Tanakh after we had left Egypt. Sitting around our modern tables is a modern adaptation. Okay, so with that in mind, what did they actually bring when they were doing this in the Mishnah time? Well, they would have this movable tray and they would bring it out, which would normally be the start of the meal. And then, of course, they would remove it. They would hide it. And this was obviously meant to provoke questions. This was there to help trigger that reaction that we still commemorate in the four questions. It's also something that we continue to keep with various customs regarding when we lift a cup and put it down, when we uncover the matzah, when we cover it. It's a way of playing peekaboo with what is normally food that has been turned into symbols of the story. So we still carry on that tradition. It's just very different and not for the same practical purpose as it was originally created. And that original Seder, back in the Mishnah time that we have the most detail for, was what we would consider very similar. It was very, very Spartan, very minimal. There was matzah, there was maror, the bitter herb, there was charoset, the mixture of fruit and wine that the maror was dipped into, and then there were two cooked dishes. We'll talk about those cooked dishes later in more detail if we have time today. If not, we'll do it next time. All right. So this is what it looked like in our classical period, and it looked like this for a very long time until we adopted new dining styles, especially in Europe, where we followed the dining styles of our Christian neighbors. And that is when we really swapped over from having this table or this or tray that was brought out into an actual table that we now would recognize as being a dining table. This became the norm for sharing meals together. And it became the norm then to have a Seder plate, to have a round plate, not necessarily with any distinctive construction, just a round platter. And you would place the various things there, and it could be shared. Sometimes when we do meals here at Temple Israel, we'll call it family style, where the dishes will just be on the table rather than a buffet line, and you just pass them around and share. And that's what the earliest form of Seder plate would have looked like. If you look here on the left-hand side, there's a picture of a plate from Spain in the pre-expulsion period. So we're looking in the 1400s here. And as you can see, there are no compartments. There's no division of this is for maror and this is for charoset. It's just a platter. And they would have put whatever was needed on that. And then everybody would have just reached and taken what they needed from that center platter on that center shared table, which of course is easier than the earlier version where everyone needed their own little table because they were scattered around on their own sofa, on their own couches. Now, this eventually develops into more and more artistically ornate and creatively crafted items. In fact, we can see here on the right-hand side, this is from Austria in the 1800s, a Seder set that is actually designed as a tier, that there are 3 layers where the 3 different slices of matzah would go. More about that next week. And then above it, you can see that they have containers for each of the Passover foods, the symbolic foods. So we end up with now purpose-built and very exclusively designed items that really could have no other purpose. While it is normal to have certain things set aside for Passover because of the kashrut issues of not wanting chametz in our dishes that are going to be used during the holiday, to have something so exclusively designed that it really could serve no other purpose becomes more and more common as our consumer culture, as our material technology continues to improve. 400 years earlier, it would have been almost impossible to make something like this silver tiered ornate Seder plate. And having a platter like this, well, would be perfect for the Seder, but on Shabbos during Passover, since it's already kosher for Passover, you could also serve your meat on that, and it would be great. So we are able to begin more and more exclusive refinement of the items. The Seder plate's not the only place where this developed. We also saw that development with things like Shabbat candlesticks, where originally they were just oil lamps, the same oil lamps you would use on any other day of the week, that were set aside on Shabbat in a particular way to avoid tampering or refueling or adjusting, which would violate Shabbat, but they were still basically the same oil lamps that you would have used on a Tuesday. And eventually those became more and more refined until they were exclusively used on Shabbat, and you had a different set of oil lamps or candlesticks that you'd use for the rest of the week. Likewise, the Chanukiah that everybody knows today, where it is a purposely built candelabra just for the holiday of Hanukkah, that is also relatively modern. In the ancient world and classical and early medieval, people would have just lined up oil lamps or put additional wicks into a trough in order to light their Chanukiah. And it would have been just called a menorah, meaning lamp, because that's all it is. Having a purpose-built Chanukiah is a relatively modern luxury. And I will just voice my little pet peeve on this particular point, because I have heard far too many people, just in the last decade in particular, correcting each other if somebody calls the lamp that we use for Hanukkah a menorah. And they say, no, it's not a menorah, it's a Chanukiah. And that is not only pedantic, it's wrong, because a Chanukiah is a variety of menorah. It is a variety of lamp. And there's nothing wrong with calling it a lamp. You don't have to call a lamp by saying, oh, that's not just a lamp, that is a special rotoscopic lamp. I mean, look, it's a lamp that has a particular purpose sometimes, but you can use a Chanukiah anytime during the year if you wanted to, if you were not actually having proper lamps, that modern lamps. So please don't be obnoxious to each other, and don't try and out jargon each other. It's not a endearing trait. A Chanukiah is a menorah. Not every menorah is a Chanukiah, of course. You need the right number, but you can make a menorah into a Chanukiah quite easily on the day, and that's what our ancestors did for most of the last few thousand years. So let's give them a break, and let's cut each other some slack too. All right, so sorry, get off my soapbox. It just, when I hear somebody correct another person on that, it really rankles me, because not only is the correction wrong, but it is very off-putting and totally unnecessary, and a way that alienates people by making them think they don't know the right jargon. And, you know, as Jews, we don't need to alienate other people. All right, so now we've got our purpose-made Seder plate. But the question becomes, what do we put on it? Now, that may sound rather unnecessary, because after all, we discussed back in the Mishnaic times that they had a very set number of things that would be brought out. There would be maror, the bitter herbs. There would be charoset, the fruit wine mix. There would be karpas, which was mentioned elsewhere in the Mishnah as an appetizer green. There would be a zeroa and a beitzah, the two cooked dishes that got settled on. Again, we'll come back to what those are doing there if we have time today. But the basic description is about 5 things plus matzah, because those are the 5 things you need in order to conduct the Seder and to do the mitzvot that are connected to the Seder. And indeed, for much of our history, if you find purpose-built Seder plates, they will have 5 um, containers, 5 spaces to hold these different items. However, if you go to a Judaica shop or online, where most people buy their Judaica now, you will find that many now have 6. And just to give you a comparison here, and it was actually quite hard, a little bit more difficult than I was expecting, to find a picture of a 5 point Seder plate compared to a 6 point Seder plate. But you'll notice that there is an extra spot in the Seder plate on the bottom right. And how that happened is a little bit of an interesting mystery. So take a look there, see if you can spot what's been added. And then we'll talk about how we ended up with a slip in our Seder plates that persists for most people today and has become more common rather than less. All right, so if you are looking carefully, you will have noticed that the thing that is out of place on the bottom Seder plate, the one that has the extra slot, is the chazeret, is the lettuce down here at the bottom. Now, how did we end up with chazeret on the Seder plate when we already have maror? And chazeret is a type of maror. That is to say, chazeret is the standard, indeed the preferred version of maror as discussed in the Mishnah. And this is maybe going to ruffle a few feathers. It does almost every time I talk about it with people. The original discussion of what maror is in rabbinic literature, because the Torah itself doesn't describe maror in any detail, other than its basic name meaning bitterness. But the original discussion in rabbinic literature and all the way through much of our history is clearly lining up with what's known as chazeret, or other types of leafy greens. Because after all, we call it a bitter herb. And herb is a classic idea that this has to be the leafy part of a plant. You'll notice, however, that both of these Seder plate diagrams are portraying the bitter herb as being a horseradish root. Why? Well, basically because horseradish became the standard version of maror, of bitter herb, in certain parts of Europe in relatively modern history, the last few hundred years. Prior to that, people would use chazeret, and people generally lived in other parts of the world, or Europe even, where you could get bitter leafy greens at the time of Passover, which is the very cusp of spring. Not so in many parts of Eastern and Northern Europe, where those bitter leafy greens had not yet ripened or grown, and they never grow at all, depending upon how far north you've gone. And so a substitute for maror was needed. And it was hit upon to use what we call horseradish. And the irony is that horseradish has now become synonymous as chazeret, as the word that originally meant leafy romaine lettuce, because so many people have misconstrued what the Mishnah meant by chazeret, because they assumed it was the thing they were already using, rather than recognizing that what they were using was a stopgap measure because they couldn't get the proper style in their particular neck of the woods. But of course, once it had become customary, once it had become established for many communities, then nobody felt that it was proper to question the presence of the bitter herb as being horseradish. Obviously, horseradish is not bitter. Moments of reflection on the taste will tell you that it is not. It is harif, it is spicy. and as such, it is not even fulfilling the proper goal. So do yourself a favor, use a bitter herb, endives, romaine lettuce, arugula sometimes will work, dandelion greens will sometimes work. I make a trip to Whole Foods every year and find the various green things that look like they're possible, and then do a sampler for myself in the weeks leading up to Pesach to find what is the most bitter this particular year. It's a fun exercise. Doesn't exactly taste great, but that's the point. And I end up with a good maror that is actually a bitter herb. But if you are sticking with two forms of maror, one of which being a horseradish, then you might end up with a chazeret. Now, there is a practical reason for that, and then we're going to end up with a mystical explanation as well. So let's deal with the practical. The practical is that according to the Haggadah and according to the rabbinic understanding of how the Seder progresses, we are meant to take and eat the bitter herbs. And when we eat the bitter herbs, we are told to dip it in the charoset, to dip it in that fruit wine mixture. Now, if you are eating horseradish, and you are eating horseradish as it is normally prepared in its ground up shredded form, dipping that mush into a second mush is not exactly what most of us would call dipping. Certainly you can mix them together, but it's not really a dunk. However, obviously a leaf dips much more readily into your charoset. And by the way, this is also a good reminder that your charoset should be dippable. If your charoset is just cubed apples with a bit of cinnamon and wine splashed on them, dipping isn't going to do much. You need something that has been ground fine enough that it will adhere to the leaf that's being dipped into it. And so many people will use the chazeret for the dipping, but they'll keep the horseradish for doing the Hillel sandwich when we put together the matzah, the maror, as part of the reminder of what we used to eat in the temple days, because that will work fine on a piece of matzah. That is to say, you can put the mushy horseradish on a piece of matzah just fine. Obviously, you can also put a leaf just fine. And then the element that's missing, because the temple is not here, is the meat that would have been part of the Passover sacrifice. Okay, hopefully I didn't confuse people too much, and hopefully you'll be a little more inclined to find your leafy bitter green for this year's Pesach. You got plenty of time. Okay, but I did mention that we end up with a mystical explanation. So the Seder plate that many of us have now, whether we realize it or not, is often based off the Arizal. This is Rabbi Luria, who is one of the great Kabbalists of the late Middle Ages. And he had in his mind a particular order in which they should be arranged on the plate. That there should be the zroa, the shank bone, on the right side, and the beitza, the egg, should be on the left side, and that the maror should be in the center. And indeed, you can see in this Seder plate down here on the bottom right that that is exactly the order that they have been arranged in. And many will continue to use that order without even realizing that this was meant as a mapping towards the sfirot, the divine emanations according to Kabbalistic teachings. Is it okay to have a Seder plate arranged differently? Well, I ask you, did the Seder plate of Spain in the 1400s have a particular map of where everything went? No, of course not. This is an interesting insight. It is a way of adding a different spin to how we approach the items on the plate, but it is by no means a requirement. It is by no means an obligatory element to properly celebrating Passover or conducting the Seder. The rabbis of the Mishnah did not seem to care even if everything was on the plate or the platter at the same time. Things were often being brought out at different moments during the evening. So there is no obligation to follow this particular form. There's nothing wrong with doing it, of course, but if you're doing it, try to connect it to its original history and thought. Look up Arizal's teachings on it and make more of it than just default, which hopefully you're beginning to understand is part of the purpose of this whole class, is to break us free from just doing things by default. Just because the Maxwell House Haggadah tells you that this is where it goes and this is what you say and this is what you do, doesn't mean you are conducting the Seder well, because you may not understand what it means, of why we're doing it, and what you can feel through the performance of this incredible ritual. I think most of us understand that there is something deep and powerful there, which is why it is still so widely observed, but we often miss out on what it can be when we are just going through the motions. There is a second stumbling block as well that I want to discuss, which is helpful and incorrect items such as this. So here we have a traditional Seder plate, and everybody loves to throw something that says traditional, or loves to throw the word traditional onto a graphic to make you think it's legit. And each item has an explanation. And unfortunately, the explanations are both right and wrong. What I mean is that when people learn an explanation as the reason we do it is, what they often learn is just an explanation. It is one interpretation, one commentary, one take. Maybe their families, maybe their communities, maybe a larger interpretation, but it may or may not have any connection to it was there. Now, why does that matter? Well, obviously, I like to know the original reasons. I think that the Seder was put together with some original intention, and I think that it is important to know that. Not just out of idle intellectual curiosity, but also out of understanding how far I can or shouldn't drift from what the Seder is trying to teach me. It becomes very easy to make up anything. Be surprised how many different things I've heard about the egg, for example, that is just, well, wrong. And drift so far and far away from the original intent, which is very powerful, and we'll get to, I think, in a minute, and which is lost in the flurry of having new and ever more creative and ever more remote interpretations of what that item is. And there is an element as well of backfill, where an item will be on the Seder plate, and then people will come up with a justification on their own, rather than actually learning what that justification is. So, for example, as I mentioned, the maror really should be a leafy green. But as it says here in this analysis, it is typically a spicy horseradish, typically, maybe commonly, but that's, like we said, incorrect, and it shouldn't be there. But having decided that it is a spicy horseradish, they now tie it back to the harsh suffering of Egypt, which is why I have seen people take mouthfuls of horseradish, tears coming down their eyes, and then they are muscling their way through it as though it is some sort of macho rite of passage. Oh, the spiciness can't beat me. That's not the emotion we are meant to feel when we eat maror. The emotion we are meant to feel when we eat maror is bitterness. It needs to be mar. And bitterness is a very different experience than pain. It's a very different experience than the actual physical suffering, which is what horseradish duplicates. Horseradish doesn't give you the emotional suffering of bitterness, of depression, of hopelessness, of feeling like this is unending and just will ruin everything. Bitterness is a fundamentally different experience. And yet, because we use horseradish, you'll find useful guides like this, spinning some yarn about, pain and tears, and missing out on what the original intent had been. And thus, we're missing out on a feeling that is essential for us to accentuate during the Passover experience. Because it's not about how much we suffered, it was about how we had given up hope. It was about how we had forgotten to even dare to dream that the slavery could end. We could endure, and we were enduring the actual pain, we were losing ourselves in the bitterness. We were losing ourselves in having our spirit crushed, not our body crushed. And that is what the maror is meant to recapture. Likewise, you'll see on this page, it is talking about the sacrificial lamb and the blood on the doorposts. While that is true, that is not the primary reason. The primary reason it is there is as a reminder of the sacrifice that was offered at the temple, first at the Mishkan, the tabernacle, and then later at the temple when it was built, which was the centerpiece of your communal shared meal. So we are reminding ourselves of what is missing. By having it just sit there, but not eating, not touching, not using, we are reminding ourselves of what is not with us right now, that there is still this gap in how we are celebrating. The charoset, you'll often hear connected to the mud and bricks and mortar that was used while we were slaves in Egypt. Absolutely true, beautiful, beautiful teaching that it's there. You'll hear people say, oh, it looks bad, but it was okay, and all sorts of other lovely teachings, perfectly fine. That's not why we have haroset. We have haroset precisely to dip the bitter herbs into as an antidote. These two go together precisely because the Seder was trying to teach us that when things are bitter, we need to find a sweetness to dip them into in order to make sure that we are not overly suffering through the bitterness. And that idea that we are allowed, that we are encouraged, indeed required to find something sweet to balance out the bitterness is a huge element of Jewish life. It's why, despite the fact that Israel is once again in a war, just on 2 days ago, we celebrated Purim and we sang and we laughed and we danced because we are still going to find that joy, that sweetness, despite the bitterness of the world situation. So make sure that you have that in mind as you are doing the dipping, rather than thinking of the bitterness of the maror into the bitterness of mortars and brick. You're doubling up on the wrong metaphor rather than seeing them as being complementary pieces one to the other. The chazeret we already talked about. Really, that is what your bitter herb should be, and the horseradish can be jettisoned. And well, yeah, we'll leave it at that. I think I've already talked about it enough. The karpas, yes, many people will talk about it. This is part of the early spring. This is the salt water as being our salty tears or the sweat of slavery. Lovely metaphors, beautiful poetry. Jews are incredibly creative. This is an appetizer, right? And that's important, right? An appetizer isn't a pointless part of the meal. The appetizer is precisely there so that it will start our stomach juices going, in order that when we reach the matzah, which is the first real solid food after the maror that we eat, we will actually eat the matzah with gratitude because we will be hungry. That wonderful Jewish joke of when do we eat, when do we eat, when do we eat? Lovely joke. It's kind of true, but it misses the point. The point is when we get to the matzah, we should feel gratitude. Most people don't like matzah. I get it. It's definitely not something that I eat year round, more than occasionally. But when we get to the matzah of the Passover Seder, we are supposed to actually want it. And the appetizer, the karpas, gets that going. And the salt water was there as a garnish. It was there deliberately in order to make it tastier and in order to make our stomach begin the process of saying, what's next? What's next? What's next? So that by the time we got to the actual matzah, we would eat it enthusiastically rather than begrudgingly. So as you can see, all of these pieces are intended to fold together and create a cohesive narrative and a cohesive emotional and gastronomic experience. But too often when we regurgitate the secondary or tertiary teachings, such as the ones on this graphic, and we lose sight of the original role that each played, we miss out on the emotional, spiritual, and sensational, on the experience of our senses that was originally built into the Seder as it was being orchestrated all those thousands of years ago. We'll continue to talk more about the Seder in detail Probably not next week, but the week after. We'll see on the timing for the other things I want to talk about. But just keep in mind already, and you could certainly continue to learn more on your own about how all these original elements were meant to work together in a complementary fashion. Okay, so with that, let's go ahead. I think for today, we'll just finish up with our two cooked dishes. So I mentioned earlier that the Mishnah talks about having two cooked dishes, which now sit on the Seder plate. There was actually a considerable amount of discussion in the Talmud about what can be those dishes. Some suggesting beets, others rice, fish, eggs, lots of different options. Now, at the end of the day, we have come as a Jewish world to basically decide that we're going to do the lamb shank and that we are going to use an egg. Now, the egg reason for its winning, if you will, is both practical as well as a pun, as well as midrashic. So the egg in a practical way is because it was one of the easiest cooked foods to actually provide for the average family. Eggs have been a staple of protein and nutrients for humanity ever since we learned to domesticate birds. And it is something that even those that are poor could often find and save for Passover. So it was a low bar to ensure that they actually would be able to have that. And Judaism has numerous such instances where the minimum is set in a way to ensure that even those that are poor can still fulfill the custom, tradition, and certainly the mitzvahs of our faith. Also, as you can see here, because of the pun, beya, which is very similar to beitza, is an Aramaic word. The Aramaic word can also mean desire. And that God wishes to redeem us. God desires to redeem us. Also, many people will point out that it's a food of mourning. It's often used for Shiva houses, and it is a reminder then that the temple is still destroyed. But ultimately, the reason why we have these two cooked dishes is because we are remembering the sacrifices of old. Now, the lamb shank, most people get that, no problem, right? Sacrifices of old, we had the lamb, absolutely right, not only in the original Passover in Egypt, but later in the Mishkan and then Jerusalem, you would have a lamb set aside that you would bring in for Passover, and usually the lamb would be shared between you and the rest of your extended family, or more commonly, with you and the other people who had gone in on the lambs. Remember that people didn't eat meat all the time. There was no supermarket to provide them meat wrapped in cellophane. And if you were going to eat meat, it meant that a whole animal had to die. And so obviously, if you were going to eat a cow and there's no refrigerator, then you're going to need to share the cow with other people, because nobody in the history of humanity has ever eaten a whole cow by themselves before it had spoiled. That's an awful lot of meat. So the lamb would be shared between yourself and many others in your community. You would all gather together and you would each get a part of it. Now, because not everybody was wealthy enough to afford that, or because many people had joined together to collectively have that lamb, it often meant that one lamb wasn't really going to provide a satisfactory amount of food for everyone. Now, you can always split into subcategories and each get your own lamb, but that gets either more expensive or more difficult to source and procure. So the solution was to offer a bonus sacrifice. Now, you can't bonus sacrifice another Passover sacrifice. That's just called having two lambs and two different Seders. So instead, what they did was what was known as a Chagiga sacrifice. Now, the Chagiga was a sacrifice where you would sacrifice another animal, usually a full sheep, a goat, maybe a cow, that would provide the additional meat that was there to fill the stomach. So you might get just a tiny little olive's worth of actual lamb from the Pesach offering, the Passover offering, but then you would get a proper chunk of meat from the Chagiga offering in order to ensure that you were actually, satiated, that you had had a happy meal. That sounds like McDonald's. That you had had a meal that made you happy because you had all the ingredients to the amount that would make a person happy. So when we have our Seder plate and we have the shank bone, we're remembering that Passover sacrifice. But when we have that additional egg on the plate, we are remembering that it's not just about minimally fulfilling what is necessary. That there are many, there aren't many things we have to do in order to say we've done the Seder. And we'll talk about this in much more detail in the next couple of sessions. But we want more. We got this much lamb, but we want a lot more to actually fill us up. And the egg is there to symbolize that additional food that was prepared in order to make the meal not only spiritually and intellectually satisfying, but also physically satisfying for our bodies. Because Judaism likes that. It likes us to feel good when we are doing good. Now, that also leads me to something that we have to bear in mind. It might feel like I have been very critical on different members of our ancestry or even of our contemporary Jewish world who often embellish and add and continue to spin new tales and new interpretations. Far from it. I love that. I think that our Judaism is richer because of it. What I want to ensure is that we keep both things, that we keep that bonus, that chagiga, that egg, that always is giving us new interpretations, new ideas, new insights, new ways to relate to, connect to, and be inspired by every element of the Seder, from things that seem trivial to the things that are most central. But I also want to make sure we don't lose sight of the bone, the actual skeleton that holds the whole thing up, that we have connection and understanding of Pesach itself, both the holiday and the sacrifice, what it meant, why God did what God did, and what our ancestors were perpetuating when we have defended this holiday over the centuries. So it shouldn't only become the egg. It shouldn't only become the embellishment. It shouldn't only become the extra decoration and the extra interpretations. Those are great, but let's make sure we keep that skeletal structure as well. And then we'll see that skeleton plus the flesh, it all fits together a whole lot better. We're going to leave it there for today. We're going to talk a little bit more about how the matzah came to be the three-type matzah, the three-sheet matzah that we all now are accustomed to. And then we'll also begin our looking at the original source texts for the Passover Seder itself to figure out what at its core it's trying to teach us, what at its core it's asking us to do, and then we can understand a little bit more the embellishments that have been added. With that, take care, everyone, and be well.